Hello, Dr. Smit, everybody. This is Dr. Dirk Smit, and he's a research associate in the Department of Adult Psychiatry at Amsterdam University, and he is going to present his work on genetics and misophonia. It's a very exciting presentation. Take it away.
Thank you very much. I hope it will be exciting. We'll be sharing my screen for a second. We'll see this wonderful zooming thing go on. Here's my presentation, and hopefully we'll start it and you can see this. Is it working?
Yes. Yes.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the introduction, and thank you for all being here online in this wonderful opportunity to share our work on the genetics of misophonia. I saw a part of the previous talk, so I hope I can continue on that work, although I will also highlight how the work that we've been doing on genetics of misophonia is definitely a little bit different. But maybe I should start a little about myself, about my path, how I got into misophonia research. I started out as a cognitive student, first at the UVA, the University of Amsterdam, here in Amsterdam, and also 2 years later at the other UVA, which is the UVA in Charlottesville, Virginia, in the field of visual perception. And after that, I did a PhD in biological psychology into the genetics of brain activity. And this is still one of my major topics via the Enigma Consortium, the genetics of brain activity. And this is still, what I do. How do genes affect our brains? So how do they think, sense, behave, and are different between different people, and what else? After my switch to the university, the Amsterdam University Medical Center, where I'm right now, the adult psychiatry department, I extended to the field of psychiatric genetics with a specific focus on the genetics of compulsivity, OCD. And I'm still leading the Psychiatric Genomics Consortium, the effort for the genetics of obsessive compulsive symptoms and hoarding symptoms. About disclosures, I have no disclosures. I'm not being paid or funded for this research. No speaker fees, stock, and employment in medical companies or etc. It turned out that the department here is a hub for treating misophonia, as was mentioned in the previous call. We do some work on misophonia, like definitions of misophonia. And I connected to the clinical staff that do the treatment, which includes 2 of the co-authors of the article that you will find a link to on the website. I connected to them because I think that genetics can be a really useful tool in investigating all kinds of disorders and conditions, and they tell a thing or two about how they come about, whether they resemble other disorders or are different. And hopefully I can show you in the upcoming presentation how genetics may help and even suggest some new avenues for treatment, although that's really far in the distance still, but also to help our thinking about the disorder by looking at the neurobiology underlying it. Since it's all about genetics, I think I need to cover a little bit of basics of genes, DNA, admittedly in the most rudimentary form that you can think of. And as you probably already know, the DNA are molecules that reside in every cell in our body, in the nucleus of the cell, where 22 pairs of these molecules live. We also have 2 sex chromosomes, X and Y, but they're not part of this talk, so we're only talking about the 22 ones that I just mentioned. So these molecules consist of strings of repeating segments, which come in 4 different forms, here depicted by the colors that you see here on the right. These are called nucleotides, and they're very long strings, those DNA molecules, but the sequence is pretty much the same between all of us. 99.8% of the sequence is exactly the same in humans, and determine our shared characteristics that make us different from other species like giraffes, fish, portobello mushrooms, for example. Only 0.2% differs, but these are the interesting bits because these differences tell us why some get epilepsies or not, some have larger standing heights and may therefore play basketball and others not, etc. The 22 DNA molecules, or actually 44 because they come in pairs, are very, very long. So even though there's only 0.2% differences in the DNA strands, there are still millions of points where they do differ. These can be statistically tested, and that's what we do, against all kinds of traits and disorders. Certain stretches of DNA are codes for proteins, essential building blocks of all our cells, and these stretches are called genes. By combining the effects that we found in the nucleotides, we actually can figure out what genes are affected and different between people. And by matching this to biological knowledge that we have in all the biology field, we can get an idea of what biological functions are involved in the disorder. So these studies that we do are called genome-wide association studies, and they have been performed for all kinds of traits, physical traits, disorders, neurological, psychiatric disorders included. In this slide, I show you how you can represent some findings of the association studies. This was the first one actually found, genome-wide association study. It was a study of age-related macular degeneration, an eye disorder. The affected gene was complement factor H, which was an immune gene. So it turned out that immune response were partly responsible for the eye deterioration that you see in this disorder. And it immediately gave an answer also for where we should look for treatment. But moving on to misophonia genetics, there's only one study on the genetics of misophonia, but I have to immediately say it's a study of a misophonia symptom. It was performed by the genetic and ancestry testing company 23andMe, published as a white paper and published online. In the white paper, they also reported another genetic study, namely on tasting preference for cilantro or aversion to it. I will highlight this result first. It sounds a bit weird, but it's because it's a great introduction on how genetic studies can work, what they can tell us about the biology of a trait or disorder. Even a complex trait like asking people the question, do you like the taste of cilantro, which was the question they asked. And they found a so-called hit on chromosome 11, the 11th DNA strand in our cells. And it turns out that these were very specific genes. And when you look at these genes right there at that spot, there are genes coding for proteins expressed in nasal tissue, makes sense, and they coded for so-called olfactory receptor proteins. Now this makes total sense. We've seen that this genetic study combined with our knowledge of the DNA and biology gives us the answer to the question, why do some people find cilantro distasteful and others not? Coming to misophonia, finally, in the same paper, 23andMe tested whether people responded to the question, does the sound of someone chewing fill you with rage? Now, this is arguably not misophonia. I mean, it is definitely not misophonia in the most inclusive sense, but it's the only one that we have for now. This is what we had to work with, and we set off seeing if we could find the biology behind this misophonia symptom. And the main association was actually this one, the chromosome 5. So what we did is looked at where is it, what are the genes there? And it turns out that it's closest to the tenurin 2 gene, which is really involved in development of neurons. But I was looking a little bit further, so I'm getting there. It might actually be a different gene that is affected. It's a GABA receptor gene that's really close. And GABA codes for a very specific type of neuron in the brain, a very important neuron, where other neurons are excitatory and increased activity GABA neurons are inhibitory, and they diminish the activity of other neurons in order to keep a balance. Logically, if the GABA genes, and there are a couple of these are affected, this can result in all kinds of disorders. And this leads, for example, to epilepsy and sleep dysregulation. GABA might sound a little bit, unknown, but we all know GABA really from effects that alcohol have on GABA. For one, it increases the effect of GABA, so there is a widespread reduction in brain activity. It's a sedating effect of alcohol. And there's medication classes like benzodiazepines, like Valium, that influence GABA and decrease GABA or increase GABA activity, again having a sedating effect. Anti-epileptic drugs also work on GABA neurons. So it leads to the first and very cautious hypothesis that GABA functions in sensory processes play a role in misophonia. Now, I wouldn't encourage everybody to run to their doctors for anti-epileptic medication treatment because we're definitely not there yet, and there are very large side effects for these drugs. So, but I think more importantly, for me at least, it tells us that genetics can show some deeper understanding of the neurobiology of the condition of misophonia and how it may arise. But this is only one thing we can do with genetics. A second type of analysis that we did was looking how misophonia genetics is shared with other disorders. It may help elucidating whether misophonia is simply a form of another disorder or a condition in itself, or maybe give hints about treatment directions. So for example, there was a relation reported with OCD. So is misophonia a type of OCD? Or is it related, like I suggested earlier in the GABA results, related to epilepsy and insomnia, only in a biological way, I have to say. And in the figure, you see a Venn diagram. On the left circle represented the genes for misophonia, on the right the circles for OCD in blue, and in the middle the genes shared between the two. But when we did the calculations, there was actually no overlap. And there was also no overlap with epilepsy and insomnia. A bit surprising because of the GABA result that we, thought was overlapping between the two. But we hope we can get a more final answer if we have a better study of misophonia. As I said, it's not the optimal study for genetic study for misophonia. I also tested for the overlap with misophonia with autism spectrum disorder. This has to do with the fact that many neurodiverse patients have sensory sensitivity issues. It turned out that these genes indeed overlapped, but strangely, negatively. So misophonia genes decreased the chance of autism spectrum. And this was surprising. We expected a slight positive overlap. And I have no ready explanation for this result. Although it tells you that there's probably something else going on. It's a different pathway to maybe similar symptoms. I also tested for the overlap with misophonia with hearing disorders. We did see a substantial overlap in genes between misophonia and tinnitus, the ear ringing disease that is so clearly audiological. So there are some neurobiological processes that these genes share. Genes for wearing hearing aid and loud music exposure may explain this. They were shared with tinnitus. And that makes sense because tinnitus appears after trauma and degenerative processes in hearing. However, these overlapping genes with tinnitus were not shared with misophonia. And that also kind of makes sense. It confirms observations that hearing is not impeded in misophonia or changed. It is in tinnitus. The overlap between misophonia and tinnitus may be related to sharing of psychological processes that we don't know yet, not from this genetic study. This has also been suggested in neurobiological models and looking at phenotypic data or behavioral data, questionnaire data. But this we didn't study. I've mostly talked about the relation with misophonia and negative symptoms and disorders, but what about positive traits? Is there something positive to say? And I looked at the possible link of misophonia with the autonomous sensory meridian response, the tingling sensation that some people have on hearing specific soft sound. It's a pleasant sensation. There's some results that people with misophonia have this more often than others, this ASMR phenomenon. Now, ASMR has been linked to the autonomous nervous system. The genes associated with the autonomous nervous system function, vagal tone, as it's called sometimes, indeed overlapped significantly with misophonia. And this gave us a model of why these phenomena tend to co-occur. If this result holds, maybe we can increase vagal tone for treatment. There are many ways of doing that: diet, yoga, exercise, and breathing techniques, for example. Possibly also exposing yourself to ASMR stimuli that are widely available on YouTube, for example. So these are just hints of what may be helpful. And hopefully I've shown you a few ways that genetics research can be useful in understanding the neurobiological contributions. Maybe it's important that DNA is not 100% the underlying cause of misophonia. We know that. It does seem to contribute a little bit. Maybe tiny deviations in the DNA contribute to the propensity for developing misophonia, given the right, or should I say the wrong circumstances. But we did get some insight into the neurobiology.
Excuse
Maybe
me?
if the drugable, sorry.
Dr. Smit, I'm so sorry to interrupt you. You're hitting your mic with your paper, so we're missing some of your, not too much, but if you could just be aware of that, we would all appreciate it. Thank you.
I don't know where the microphone is, but I will.
Oh. Okay, thank you.
Okay, so where was I? So it's not 100% genetic. That's definitely not the case. There's environmental circumstances contributing a lot to misophonia. But we do get a little idea of what the neurobiology of misophonia is. And, maybe even a druggable target. Not that I'm suggesting that we should, look for drugs in many cases. And there's more possibilities I didn't even touch upon. We can look with brain regions that could be magnetically stimulated, or with genetics, you can also think about subtyping misophonia. And an important part of the work of genetics is also to establish disorders like misophonia as separable from other disorders. Maybe we can use this kind of information for subtyping and for individualized treatment. And I therefore end with a limitation and also a clear, idea and a plea, maybe even. It's not based on a genetic study of misophonia itself, the disorder. It's all by, on a symptom. And as we've seen in the previous talk, that might not be 100% correctly reflecting misophonia as a disorder. So what we need is a larger genetic study of misophonia, actual misophonia. And we're actually working on this, but we need the funding and the people to actually do the big GWAS study the genome-wide association study that could help us. And with that, I would like to thank my co-authors at the Amsterdam University Medical Center, psychiatrist Damiaan Denys and Nienke Vulink. Also co-author and friend Alex Hoetink, who's also a field hockey teammate, and my good friend and colleague and geneticist Abdel Abdellaoui. And I would also like to thank Melissa Bakker, who wrote a thesis on the topic, but I didn't have her picture and couldn't contact her anymore. And definitely would like to thank 23andMe and their customers for the contribution of their data, on which this research is based. And with that, I would
thank you, Dr. Smit. Thank you. Don't go anywhere because we have questions. Okay, yes. So the first question, what would be needed to do a proper genetics study of misophonia?
That is a very good question. The biggest issue is sample size in genetics. As I said, there's millions of associations that we test in such studies. And that also means, that's definitely the strength, but it's also a big problem because the effects that these little nucleotides have on a trait or a disorder are very, very tiny. So we need very, very, very many people. I'm also in the genetic study of obsessive compulsive disorder, and we finally have a sizable study, and that meant we are like slightly over 30,000 cases compared to, I think it was over a couple of 100,000 controls who don't have the disorder. So this is the amount of people that we're thinking about. So if it, at least 60, 70, 80, 90,000 people would be necessary, cases and controls added. That would be great. Now the problem is that as I understand, there's no 100% clear criteria for the disorder, as we heard in the previous talk, and that might complicate the story a little bit. If there's like differences in how clinicians are, categorizing who has misophonia and who hasn't, or it might be a different disorder, then you kind of run into problems. It becomes heterogeneous, and you will need more cases to actually find what we call genetic signal. And the genetic signal will then start overlapping with other disorders that you weren't really interested in. Or you might have, if you have a very narrow definition of misophonia, it will be very hard to find enough cases. But, turns out, given the previous talk about the prevalence, I don't think we will have that problem really.
Dr. Smit, another question. How can people sign up to volunteer for any genetic study that you may conduct in the future?
Oh, I wish I had a link. And I'm very glad to hear this, that there's at least, people are willing to help. I don't have the funding yet, and we are looking for that. So I'm very glad to hear that. Probably will not be a problem to find willing participants in this study, but we still have to have the willingness, or the payment for it. People don't do this for free. The genotyping and the storage of DNA and saliva that we need to collect. I will definitely contact CARE as soon as we have secured our funding, but that might be still a little while away. We're working on it.
Thank you, and we're all going to hope for the best with that. Next question. Is it possible that misophonia is a newer condition, one that arose more recently with changes in the built environment, personal electronics, social media, or are there mentions of what might be misophonia in historical documents decades ago, centuries? And there's a little more to the question. I just need to scroll down. Of course, then I lost it. Okay. How important do you think the gene environment, I guess, linkage is genetics?
It's
a big question.
Yeah, that's a very, very good question. That's a very active research area, and it's almost impossible not to have gene-environment interaction, is my belief. But I don't know this in the specifically for misophonia. That is as I told you, I've had different training, so I got into the subject a little sideways. So not as Dr. Nienke Vulink, who is like a real expert on the matter, but we do have some experience, especially my friend Abdel Abdellaoui on the bottom right picture is certainly working a lot on the gene-environmental interaction work. We know there is gene-environmental interaction, for example, in substance use disorders, where certain environments will, lead for certain people with a propensity to take drugs. It will enable them to actually do it and get show the behavior that they're not supposed to or that they don't want to have. That creates a disorder. So that in misophonia we can think of very similar mechanisms, and it's almost, well, there has to be some environmental component to that activates the genetic liability.
Thank you.
I'm sure.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I just have another question.
No, that's good.
So,
we're going.
What do you make of the findings from your study that misophonia genetics were not very related to OCD or negatively related to autism, but related to anxiety and several other mental health problems?
We're at 10 minutes.
Thank you. Another big question.
That is a big question. So yeah, it was a little bit surprising, the finding about OCD, although I have to say that most of the overlap, like like comorbidity analysis that have been done in our department showed a very large overlap, not with OCD itself, although it was there, but OCPD, so the obsessive compulsive personality disorder. We're talking about a real disorder, not just having a personality. So what there was an overlap. There was people were suffering of similar symptoms, OCPD symptoms, so the personality disorder. Now, from this, we concluded that, okay, well, probably we will find some overlap with OCD itself, because it's kind of like you have the personality that is associated with obsessive compulsive disorder. But in the end, it turned out not to be there. For me, what I'm missing to actually give a good answer about that is that we don't have the genetic study of personality disorders. Basically, we're missing that. So I would like to explore that.
Yeah. What about the negative association related to autism? I think that's surprising for a lot of people.
That was surprising, and I in a way, because the symptoms might be considered a little bit overlapping. I mean, it's sometimes there's even anger at certain sounds, although it sounds a little bit more. There's many ways that you can have emotional responses to sounds. So, and it tells me that the origin of the sensory sensitivity in autism is different. It has a totally different neurobiological origin, and for that reason, we kind of need to figure out how. Well, I guess we can just take it for granted. I hope this is one of the things that genetics might tell us. Even though there's like a phenotypic overlap, and we see this also in other disorders. For example, also there's some overlap in symptomology with OCD and autism as well, like precision things, wanting to have things really neat. But there as well, you see that there is no big overlap between the two disorders. So that's another example. We do see some overlap that we call phenotypic, that's in the behaviors or in the thoughts that people have, patient group have. Whereas then if we look genetically, there is no overlap at all, or it may be in comorbidity research. So that's a very interesting part of my work. On the other hand, also with OCD, for example, you see a large genetic overlap with other disorders, for example, with bipolar disorder. That is also a bit surprising. And so that goes actually a little bit the other way around, where there is genetic overlap between disorders where there not necessarily had to be one. And there's causes for biological mechanisms that will kind of like increase the risk for both disorders.
And certainly, Dr. Smit, one can have both disorders, in which case there may be a high rate of comorbidity, so that you're not seeing the overlap in the actual genes, but that doesn't mean in a person they don't have both sets of genes for sensory sensitivity or OCD and autism. I mean,
that's
right?
entirely possible. If there's like no correlation, that doesn't mean that you cannot have, you can only have one at a time. It's still possible that you have both. So that's or like both the risks. If we talk about genetics, you can have risk for both disorders, definitely. It's just not that they tend to co-occur, or that there are shared mechanisms. So if we talk about genetic correlations, we kind of like talk about shared mechanisms between two disorders. If there's no shared mechanisms, it can still co-occur.
We're at 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chris. I think I got most of the questions. Maybe you could just say a little bit about what we as people with misophonia, or we as clinicians, can take from genetic studies? How is that meaningful to somebody with misophonia? What can I take? What is the take-home message here?
Yeah, good question, because take-home messages is what we, should present here. My take-home message was a little bit more general in a way. So although we in psychiatric genetics and genetics of disorders in general, we want to kind of like give answers to the biological mechanisms that play a role, or maybe moderate the effect, right, in gene-environment interactions, for example. What we would like to show is that I've basically shown two things. So one is, for example, we can exploit genetic studies and use them as a tool to figure out whether there overlaps with other disorders. And one of the important issues is that misophonia is not kind of like a registered disorder, right? If people are treated here, they kind of like treated in the psychiatric department, and they get treatment for their misophonia symptoms, but it's treated, kind of like you have to register it as an anxiety disorder or an obsessive compulsive disorder, because there's no box to tick for the insurance companies, for example. And this is kind of like a workaround. But with the genetic studies, you can start looking at okay, well, is the disorder basically is it obsessive compulsive disorder? We kind of like shown genetically that that's not the case. There's no shared biological mechanism, and if that's the case, it should be registered as something else. And if we have enough evidence also from all kinds of other studies that probably will be presented today and have been presented before me, on the prevalences, you can probably look at overlap disorders and whether there's symptoms that are shared or not. And you can make it a separate entity and then treat it as such, as separate. And I think that's one of the most important things that genetic studies can help with. And the other one I've also presented on is you can look at the biological side of it. For example, look at how the autonomous nervous system is involved. And that will give you an angle like, okay, well, maybe we should start looking at that and see if certain treatments for reducing vagal tone or increasing vagal tone, sorry, I have to say increase, because that's the good side, can help in reducing symptoms in misophonia. So we'll give you a direction for further treatment research. It's not research into treatment itself or clinical trial, but it's the basis on which we can start running clinical trials.
Thank you, Dr. Smit. I want to stop you because we are out of time. And there were a few more questions that I didn't get to. Perhaps people maybe could email you, but there's someone asking how they can help you with funding. So is there, I guess under our resources, you can certainly find, we have all the emails. So
okay.
So thank you.
So my email is available at the site, right?
Great. Yes. Thank you
Yes.
very much for that. That was really fascinating. And I'm going to go to the next meeting. Thank you very much for the questions.
We'll go there.